Good morning. This is a week the Prime Minister must wish he could forget. On Wednesday, Boris Johnson apologised in the House of Commons for attending a bring-your-own-booze party in the Downing Street garden at the height of lockdown. He says he didn't realise it was a party. Just when he thought it couldn't get much worse, on Friday, his government had to apologise to the Queen. The contrast between the Queen sitting alone in the pews at St George's Chapel at her husband's funeral and the lurid detail of staff dancing and drinking the night before in the basement of number 10 could not have been more stark. Now the Prime Minister waits for a civil servant called Sue Gray to finish her ever-expanding report into what exactly was going on in government during lockdown. Can it save him, or is this just a stay of execution? This morning, in the first of our New Year leader interviews, I'll be joined by the leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, and by the man who gave the COVID press conference just minutes before that infamous bring-your-own-booze party, Oliver Dowden, now the chair of the Conservative Party. But it's not all politics. We'll be live in Melbourne to cover the breaking news this morning as Novak Djokovic is told he will be deported from Australia. And to review the news on a very busy morning. He's back, last seen storming out of the GMB studio and soon to be returning to our screens on Talk TV. It's Piers Morgan. And joining him, the Deputy Political Editor of The Spectator, Katy. But first, a summary of the news with Catherine Downs.
Thanks, Sophie. Good morning. Our main story, as you mentioned, breaking news from Melbourne. In the last couple of hours, the world tennis number one, Novak Djokovic, has lost his fight against deportation. A panel of judges has upheld a decision by the Australian government to cancel the player's visa because he's unvaccinated against COVID-19 and poses a threat to public health. And we'll have more on that story, as we heard later on in this programme. Elsewhere, pressure continues to mount on Boris Johnson as the row over parties held in Downing Street while England was in lockdown intensifies. Former Minister Tim Loughton has become the 6th Conservative MP to call on the Prime Minister to resign, saying his constituents felt troubled, angered or appalled. The government has urged people to reserve judgment until senior civil servant Sue Gray's inquiry is finished. The Duke of Sussex has launched a legal challenge for the right to pay for police protection when he's in the UK. Prince Harry lost his security when he stepped back from royal duties in 2020. He says his private protection team in the US doesn't have adequate jurisdiction abroad or access to UK intelligence information needed to keep his family safe. And from tomorrow, 16 and 17-year-olds in England will be able to book their COVID booster jab or attend a walk-in vaccination centre. The latest stage of the rollout will only apply to teenagers who received their second dose at least 3 months ago, with around 40,000 expected to be eligible initially. Previously, the booster was only recommended for people in that age group who were deemed clinically vulnerable. And that is all from me for now. The next news on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. But for now, back to you, Sophie.
Thank you very much. Well, let's have a look at the papers this morning. The front pages, first of all, starting with the Sunday Times. Johnson prepares mass clear-out to save his own skin, is what the Sunday Times is saying. And also that extraordinary photograph on the front page there of the underwater volcano that erupted in the Pacific yesterday. The Mirror's main story focusing on Prince Andrew, saying that his lawyers want to quiz his accuser's psychologist to find out whether Virginia Giuffre is suffering false memories of meeting him. The Sunday Telegraph, their big splash this morning is of the Prime Minister's wife. They say that she broke COVID rules and that she regrets breaching social distancing guidelines in September 2020 at a members' club at a friend's engagement party. The Observer, Tories will oust the Prime Minister if he tries to dodge Partygate blame, they say. The Mail is all about the BBC this morning. Nadine Dorries, the Culture Secretary, freezing the licence fee, she says, for 2 years as left-wing bias row rages. In fact, she's tweeted this morning saying that the licence fee settlement, this one, will be the last. The Sunday Express, the Prime Minister ditches all rules, but will it save him, they ask? And The Sun on Sunday, focusing on the love life of Zayn Hadid. Now, Piers Morgan is back
Good
on morning television. It's been a while. I'm joined by Piers and, of course, Katy, who is here to review the papers with us. Piers, it's been, what, 9 months since you were on television?
I've been on breakfast television for nearly a year. It feels sort of weird, but nice. And my one question for you is, am I allowed to have an opinion? Because that was the problem before.
You've come to tell us about the papers. And there is a lot for you. A perfect news storm day, I would say. A lot for you to get your teeth into. What are you going to start with?
Well, there's a common theme, isn't there, with all of the people in the news, whether it's Novak Djokovic, who's just been told he's going to be deported for breaking all sorts of rules. You have Boris Johnson, who doesn't believe the rules apply to him. You have Prince Andrew, doesn't believe the rules apply to him. Prince Harry's popped his head up from California, again wanting to have his royal cake and eat it. So there's a common theme of people in powerful positions who basically want to have one rule for them and one rule for the rest of us. And Djokovic, in a way, sums this up. He's the world's #1 tennis player. He's a fantastic athlete, but he's also become an iconic figure for the anti-vax brigade. He's also systematically, throughout this whole process, revealed himself to be someone who just doesn't abide by any conventional rules. He says he tested positive on December the 16th. There are question marks about that. But if he did, he was then seen breaching all the rules in Serbia and then in Marbella, where he flew to.
Turning up in photographs with children the next day.
Posing with people and breaking the rules and so on. And then he gets to Australia, where he's lied on his immigration form and so on. And the bottom line for Novak Djokovic, it doesn't matter how good you are at tennis or how rich and powerful you are. When it comes to the pandemic, we're all in this together or we're not. And he's just been told that D-Day for Djokovic means deportation back to Dubai. And I think it's the right decision. And I think it sends the right message, which is actually, no, sorry, the rules apply to everybody.
Katy, what about parties in number 10? Talking of rules, plenty of that in the papers today.
Yeah, I think the big question in politics this weekend is, will Boris Johnson cling on? In a way, it's a strange question to even ask if you think about that majority of 80 just 2 years ago. But things have really moved, in large because of the Partygate row. And Boris Johnson admission this week that he did attend, perhaps for a short period, but did attend a drinks party in the 10 Downing Street garden when there were restrictions for the rest of the country. Now, Tim Shipman, I think in the Sunday Times, has a very illuminating piece which asks, is the lame duck Prime Minister finally sunk? And I think what's interesting about this piece, and there's a few parts, is Boris Johnson apologised this week in the Commons chamber, but increasingly MPs believe that that apology was quite limited. And Tim Shipman recounts a meeting Boris Johnson had with his team the day after that ITV email published the email about the event he went to. And he is ultimately asking his advisors how they got him into this mess and blaming them. And there is a sense that this Prime Minister, to get out of his current problems if he can, will oust members of his top team if he survives the Sue Gray report. And I think this is going to cause issues with his party if he looks like he isn't taking responsibility. The other quite interesting detail is the fact that Boris Johnson almost has a two-pronged strategy. So ousting lots of staff, not him, obviously, and then in the meantime embarking on Operation Red Meat to show to his Tory support base that, yes, he really is the right Tory Prime Minister still. So you see the BBC licence fee being frozen and other, I think, grassroots-friendly policies being planned, including levelling up, fleshing it out. Will it work? I think the jury's really out, and there's quite a few hurdles for the Prime Minister still.
Piers.
Well, I don't think the jury's out at all. The court of public opinion has come back and found him guilty of the most brazen, rank hypocrisy imaginable.
Have they really? The court of public opinion?
I think so. And just
that is your view, to be fair.
It's not. I don't think it's just my view. The polls suggest that his popularity is sinking to all-time lows. But it's not really about that. This really comes down, I think, to that one party. Forget all the others for a moment. The one party back in May 2020. This was a time when the entire country had been in lockdown for weeks on end. This was a time when you couldn't go and see loved ones when they were dying in hospital from this virus. This was a time when, on that day that they had this party, Oliver Dowden, the government minister, who you've got coming on, and it'll be interesting to see what he says about this, but literally minutes after he has the brass neck to stand there at the Downing Street press conference and order everybody, you're allowed to only meet one person outside at 2 metre distance from another household. I met my eldest son that day for the first time in 3 months at a 2 metre distance. I wasn't even able to shake hands with my son, but I had it on that scale of what was going on. I had a cousin who couldn't see his dying father. I had a great school friend who couldn't see her mother, who died in a care home from COVID, had to say goodbye on FaceTime, then had a funeral for a handful of people. I had a co-worker, Kate Garraway, at Good Morning Britain, who couldn't go and see her critically ill husband. All over the country, people had these kind of stories, and they were horrific stories of separation. And yet the very people who were telling the country to do this were having a massive knees up in Downing Street that night and carried on having knees ups throughout the entire pandemic. And it's a complete disgrace.
This does not mean that the Prime Minister will go, though, does it?
It doesn't mean he will go. It does mean he should go, because public trust in the government has surely been completely shattered. Now, the Conservative Party will decide whether he will continue as leader, but every Conservative MP must be looking at all these stories and concluding, surely, that confidence, public confidence, has been irrevocably destroyed by what's happened here. I can't think of a bigger breach, frankly, than a global health emergency where the government make these draconian orders and completely disregard them with impunity.
Katy, I mean, that's Piers' view. We're all
I'm not alone.
You're not alone. We are all waiting for Sue Gray and to find out what her report comes up with, its fact-finding mission. And meanwhile, the papers are still full of the runners and riders who could take over from the Prime Minister.
Yes, and I think the reason there's so much speculation over who could take over from the Prime Minister is one of the things that makes this particularly difficult for Boris Johnson is it's so much a Boris Johnson crisis. This is a scandal which is about his Downing Street. Yes, he may not be at every single party, but it's a top-down culture in Downing Street. And that means that MPs and ministers are starting to ask, if this really is as toxic as it currently seems to be in the polls, and that doesn't change in the coming weeks, is the best way to stop it being a permanent Conservative crisis to change leader. I think, though, this Telegraph spread, which puts out very visually the various runners and riders, also points to part of the reason Boris Johnson might not be pushed out just yet. There is no consensus on who will take over from Boris Johnson. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, is seen as the favourite. Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, also. But both have critics. There's plenty of MPs saying that they don't want Liz Truss to be Prime Minister. They'd rather Boris Johnson, similar to Rishi Sunak. And you have the odds of, some newer MPs, the Education Secretary, Nadine Zahouri is being mentioned.
Oh, apology, we have a problem on the line there. But
Piers, let me just... risk of the unknown is one of the things keeping Boris Johnson a little bit safer than...
Well, he might be safe, but he's completely damaged, rather like a ship that's been
Can I just ask you, Piers, about, I mean, James Slack, who it was his leaving do on the night before the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral. He was working in Downing Street at the time, head of communications there. He's now gone to The Sun. Is that partly, I mean, he obviously knew exactly what was going on. We've only just found out about it. Is that partly, you work for The Sun now, is that partly why The Sun is not covering? I mean,
I don't know.
Zayn on the front page.
Well, they've been covering these stories.
Perhaps
it's obviously
not as prominently as other newspapers.
Well, you'd have to ask The Sun about that. I've just joined as a columnist. What I would say is he's come out and very emphatically in a statement said it shouldn't have happened, and he's been very contrite about that, and that's the right thing to do. And there will be lots of staffers, I think, who will be feeling that way. But the rot comes from the top. If the Prime Minister, whose home is number 10 Downing Street, is attending these parties and glad-handing people, as was reported, then that, to me, is the more significant part of this scandal, and that is the one that has to be made accountable, not just to every minister, but to every Tory MP right now. They've got to ask themselves with their conscience.
Let's have a look at the Mirror as well. You've got another story there, how they're covering it this morning.
Well, it's a bridge too far is the headline. Well, fridge too far, yeah. I mean, Boris Johnson ran into a fridge to hide from me on Good Morning Britain once, so fridges are quite uppermost, I'm sure, in his mind. But they actually brought in a fridge to have their Friday night drinkies. But bear in mind, again, that wouldn't normally matter. This matters because they were ordering the rest of the country that they couldn't do this kind of thing. It's the hypocrisy and the brazen double standards which I think is really cutting through to the British public. And whether you like Boris or not, personally, I've always rather liked the guy. But all the things that, I wrote in my first Sun column last week, all the things that people voted for him for, the kind of shambolic style, the rebellious style, the not a normal politician style, They're now all sticks to beat him with, because it turns out in a global pandemic, they're not the qualities you want in a leader.
Let's move on to the royal family, because there are stories about both Prince Andrew and Prince Harry. Katy, you start with Prince Andrew.
Yes, so the Mirror reports on how Prince Andrew could fight this civil action against him in America, which we now know will go ahead despite efforts by Prince Andrew to stop this. We know that he's going to fight as a private citizen, and it says Andrew, this is the headline, could not remember Virginia, and now he's accusing her of having false memory syndrome. Now, false memory syndrome is something that Ghislaine Maxwell used in her defence in her trial, which is the link to this, and it clearly was not successful because she was found guilty on several counts. And therefore, I think the big issue for Boris, the big issue really here, when you're looking at how Andrew could fight this, is there is a photo. There's a photo that puts him there. And I think that that is going to be much harder when it says to who has the false memory. And ultimately, what is this going to do to the Queen on a Jubilee year? It's already quite embarrassing for the royal family. And I think you can see that in how he has been stripped of various titles in the past week.
And let's talk about Prince Harry as well, because he is also in the papers this morning. This is about his protection, his security when he comes to the UK.
Well, it's another example. I mean, it was absolutely chillingly inevitable that these two would pop their heads up again right when the Queen least wants them to. I feel so sorry for the Queen right now. It's her Platinum Jubilee coming.
Tell us what the story is, though.
Well, I'm just going to lead up to this because I think the timing of it is so appalling as well. She's lost her husband. She's got this awful situation with Andrew. And now her grandson has been baiting the royal family and the monarchy all year, has now popped up from his mansion in California to say that when he comes back to the UK, he wants to have the British police protect him. Well, sorry, mate, that's not how this works.
But he's offering to pay for it.
I don't give a damn.
I know, but just to be very clear, he's not saying that he wants the taxpayer to fund his security. He is saying he wants the British police to protect him when he's here, and he will pay for it.
Fine. Why should the British police protect him? He's now a private citizen. He doesn't do any royal duties. They're making hundreds of millions.
He's a high-profile private
they're
citizen.
making hundreds of millions of dollars, fleecing their royal titles, which they still have, while simultaneously trashing the royal family and the institution of the monarchy that his grandmother is the head of. And now they want to have their cake and eat it as always and say, when we're back in the country, we want to be treated like other royals. You're not other royals. In fact, I wouldn't let them have the royal titles. I think there's, again, a brazen double standard. If you want to have the royal titles, do royal duty, like your grandmother, who is the pillar of royal duty.
Let's talk to Katy now. We haven't mentioned the word COVID yet. Well, not really. COVID restrictions may be lifted, says the Mail.
Yes, and we know that the current Plan B restrictions expire at the end of the month, and we're now expecting, the government hope is to announce an end to all Plan B restrictions, with the exemption that masks would stay, we expect, on public transport and also in shops. And I think that this is clearly good news in the sense Omicron was not what we were warned by Sage it could be if you look around Christmas time, but it also points to the fact that Boris Johnson, in a different universe where there weren't parties, I think could be winning some points right now from his MPs and voters for this, but it has been overshadowed. OK,
Katy, and Piers, I'm just going to ask you one more question about yourself, your new show, because you are back here on television. We haven't seen you for a very long time. What are you actually going to be doing? Well,
I'm launching a new global daily TV show for Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation and Fox America, starting in the spring. It'll air daily in the UK, daily in the US, and in Australia daily as well. So I'll be a tri-continental irritant, which is something I've been aspiring to be for quite some time. But no, it's going to be opinion, debate, big interviews. So if you've missed me on morning TV, I'm sorry, but I'll be back very soon. If you haven't missed me, I'm not sorry.
Piers Morgan, lovely to see you. Katy Balls, lovely to see you too. Thank you both very much for joining me this morning.
By the way, you should get the job full time. It's great at this.
Now for the weather, a slightly grey overcast start here, and let's see what Thomas Schaffenacke has for us today in store.
Yeah, I'll be your irritant this morning. It's a little grey at the moment, has to be said, across southern parts of the UK. Got a little bit of rain around too here and there. But you know what? The good news is that things are going to brighten up later on today. So I think skies will look like this eventually, at least across the northern half of the country. So beautiful weather, I think, to come this afternoon for Edinburgh, Newcastle, Belfast, Liverpool. But in the south, we'll have a bit of cloud before it finally clears away and maybe some spits and spots as rain. So what's happening tonight then? The winds are dying down. There will be some mist and fog forming in one or two areas, Wales and England. A touch of frost to come tonight for sure, but not in Scotland, particularly the north. That's because the breeze is coming off the ocean, so it's going to be a little bit milder here. So here's the morning then on Monday. Cloudier and breezier in the far north of the country, but the rest of the UK wakes up to plenty of sunshine, patches of mist and fog here and there. And the temperatures tomorrow, 8 degrees pretty much across the board. Tuesday morning looks as though it's going to be pretty misty and foggy, but overall, and this is the week ahead, as far as Friday, it's actually looking pretty calm, pretty settled. Sophie, back to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, the civil servant, Sue Gray, is this very minute, no doubt, working through the long list of government parties during lockdown. It is a lot to go through, so we asked Chris Mason to do the same for us.
The advent of these rows about parties in government when parties were banned began on Wednesday, the 1st of December. The Daily Mirror revealing a couple of shindigs, a leaving do on November the 27th, 2020, and what the paper described as a festive bash a few weeks later on Friday, December the 18th. In late 2020, these were the rules in London. No mixing of households indoors, apart from support bubbles, maximum of 6 outdoors. Bubbles there may have been in number 10, but not of the support variety. The Prime Minister said,
"What I can tell the right honourable gentleman is that all guidance was followed completely during number 10.
A week later, though, ITV News got hold of a mocked-up news conference involving the Prime Minister's advisers, which had been recorded on Tuesday, December the 22nd, 2020, a few days after that party.
On Twitter, that there was a Downing Street Christmas party on Friday night. Do you recognise those reports?
I went home. Hold on. His fictional party was a business meeting. And it was not socially distanced.
The day after this video saw the light of day, Allegra Stratton called it a day. Boris Johnson said he was furious seeing his aides laughing about lockdown rules and asked the country's leading civil servant, Simon Case, to look into it all. But he only lasted 10 days as the party investigator after, yes, you guessed it, it turned out a bash was held in his own office. What came next was a trickle of revelations about do's dotted across Whitehall before Christmas 2020. Eyebrow-raising events emerging at the Department of Education and Transport, both, as well as news of unplanned office drinks at the Treasury. But what is a party? There are some grey areas, but then there was this. Ban-Marie and Bonhomie. This is social distancing Sean Bailey style, the Conservative candidate for London Mayor at the time. He's since resigned from chairing a London Assembly committee. Oh, and one more for now. A quiz in Downing Street before Christmas 2020. The Prime Minister between a colleague bedecked in tinsel and another just out of shot in what looked like a Santa hat. Enter next this woman. This is Sue Gray, who currently, on the face of it, has the Prime Minister's fate in her hands. Appointed just before Christmas, she's a senior civil servant trying to catalogue all this partying. And before we got to the Christmas just gone, one more picture. This is the Downing Street Garden on the 15th of May 2020. The Prime Minister said what we're seeing here is people at work talking about work. What we're also seeing is the Prime Minister's wife and people drinking wine. And the rules in May 2020? Avoid in-person meetings. Only absolutely necessary participants should attend meetings. Businesses should also take reasonable steps to avoid people being gathered together. Right, let's call this half-time. The Christmas and New Year that we've just had intervened and the party news quietened. Until that is January the 7th, the Friday before last. Dominic Cummings, who'd survived a brush with the COVID rules himself while working for the Prime Minister, alleged that an actual party in May 2020 had happened that shouldn't have happened. And so the Prime Minister was asked whether he was there.
All of that, as you know, is the subject of a proper investigation by Sue Gray.
So have you already been interviewed by Sue Gray, and if not, do you object to her questioning you again about this?
All that is subject for an interview, for an investigation by Sue Gray.
ITV News then got hold of the invite for the Knees Up. Martin Reynolds, the Prime Minister's principal private secretary, sent an email saying, "We thought it would be nice to have socially distanced drinks. Bring your own booze." A reminder of the rules at the time. Schools were closed for most, pubs were closed, restaurants were closed. Cue a more contrite Boris Johnson.
When I went into that garden just after 6 on the 20th of May 2020 to thank groups of staff before going back into my office 25 minutes later to continue working, I believed implicitly that this was a work event.
It prompted the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, to do something he had not done before.
He was hosting boozy parties in Downing Street. Yes. Is he now going to do the decent thing and resign?
An interesting strategy, because an opposition leader leaves themselves with no headroom, nowhere else to go if they call for a Prime Minister to go, and they don't. Incidentally, Sir Keir is partial himself to office-based refreshment that doesn't involve milk and 2 sugars. Here he is last spring while campaigning ahead of the Hartlepool by-election, which they lost. The rules at the time: you must not socialise indoors except with your household or support bubble. Labour say he was working and it didn't break the rules. Now, you'll remember this picture of the Queen sitting alone at the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral last April. Well, another story emerged this week, this time in the Daily Telegraph, which told us of 2 staff parties held in Downing Street the night before the funeral, during which an advisor acted as DJ, another was dispatched to the Co-op with a suitcase to stock up on wine. One of the do's was for this man, James Slack, the outgoing Director of Communications, and so in charge of communicating the rules that, well, his bash broke the rules. Mr. Slack with the messages didn't get the message, his own message, and now he's grovelling. Here are then the bashes in chronological order, the classified results if you like, and yes, it runs to more than 1 page. Any minister possessed of an ample mixture of loyalty and masochism has been offered to the airwaves, some of them sounding more convinced of their message than others. And it all ultimately leaves just one question.
Do you think that Boris Johnson will still be the Prime Minister in a month's time?
I think that I think he probably will be.
That pregnant pause. Chris, it does feel like everything right now is in a holding pattern.
Yes, because there's this inquiry going on, and there's also that big question, Sophie, of what other videos or emails or texts or invites could emerge from hibernation from smartphones in Whitehall and see the light of day in the newspapers or the TV bulletins. Meanwhile, as I say, on goes this investigation. Conservative MPs this weekend in their constituencies encountering red-hot anger from lots and lots of constituents because, of course, the pandemic was something that nobody could possibly be a bystander to. Nobody could be an observer to. We were all involved in, and so it forces an opinion out of everyone. But it's worth taking a step back. So we now know that there are 6 Conservative MPs who have publicly said the Prime Minister should resign. There's probably quite a few more who were saying it privately. You need to get to 54 for there to be a leadership contest. It is hard to get rid of a Prime Minister who doesn't want to go. And the next general election could be as far away as nearly 3 years. So there's plenty of time for political water to head under several bridges. And so it's not certain what is going to happen. Hence the observation there from the Conservative backbencher of probably.
Chris Mason, thank you. Now, you might not remember exactly what you were doing on the 20th of May 2020, but Oliver Dowden, my next guest, does. At 5 p.m, the then Culture Secretary stood at a podium in number 10 Downing Street and set out the rules governing our lives at that stage of the national lockdown.
You can spend time outdoors and exercise as often as you like, and you can meet one person outside your household in an outdoor public place, provided that you stay 2 metres apart.
Well, the chair of the Conservative Party, Oliver Dowden, joins me this morning. Good morning. Thank you very much for coming in to talk to us. 9 minutes after you finished that press conference telling the nation what the rules were, there was a gathering just a few hundred metres away from you in the garden at Downing Street, around 40 people bringing their own booze to enjoy the lovely weather. Did you know about it? What did you see?
No, I didn't know about the event. As you might imagine, as Culture Secretary, I went to speak in this press conference. Actually, the press conference was about steps we're taking to support the creative industries and the creation of this task force, which, by the way, led to the £1.5 billion Cultural Recovery Fund, which saved many businesses up and down the country. I then also set out what the rules were pertaining at the time, and I think, as you've seen previously, that was stage one. And the moment I'd finished the press conference, I left, got in my car, went home and had dinner with my family.
But that was a Wednesday afternoon. It was beautiful weather that day. Around 100 people had been invited to drinks in the Downing Street garden by email, a pre-planned event. Did you sense any sort of party atmosphere then?
No, I think it's actually quite important for you, and more importantly your viewers, to understand how Downing Street is. Downing Street is not just the Prime Minister's home. Of course, he has a flat above the shop, as everyone's familiar with. But also, it's an office with many hundreds of people in it, and it's segmented into different parts. I was in the formal front-facing part of the building, went upstairs, and I had an appropriate briefing beforehand, did the press conference, and I left.
But did you see, I mean, there were about 30, 40 people gathering 9 minutes after you finished that. You would have been leaving at the same time as they were arriving. I mean, did you see people going outside? Did you sense any of what was going to go on?
No, I didn't, Sophie, but this is precisely why it's important that there is a full investigation into all of the facts, and that's why the Prime Minister set this up. But I would also say, and I completely appreciate your underlying point on all of this, this event was totally wrong. It shouldn't have happened. The Prime Minister has rightly apologised for it. People feel angry about what's been going on in Downing Street. I feel angry about what's going on in Downing Street. But the correct process now is to get to the full facts and then for the Prime Minister to appear before Parliament, which he will do, and to be held to account. But I can assure you the Prime Minister is both very contrite and deeply apologetic for what happened, but also, more importantly, is determined to make sure that this can't be allowed to happen, and that we address the underlying culture in Downing Street.
Deeply apologetic, but in the Commons he said that he thought that it technically fell within the guidance. You'd just been telling us what the guidance was, and that was that you could only meet one person outside, socially distanced. You had around 40 in the Downing Street garden.
Yes, these events really should not have happened. There's absolutely no doubt about that, but it's important that we have a proper process to get to the bottom of all the facts. And I would say, in respect of what the Prime Minister's position, you heard what he said in Parliament, and that's been reinforced by subsequent conversations I've had with him. He is very much apologetic for this happening. It shouldn't have happened. The task for us now is to make sure that we address the underlying culture in Downing Street, and I know that the Prime Minister is completely committed to doing that.
But the word technically fell within the guidance. If somebody, one of the members of the public, had asked you at that press conference whether they could that afternoon, at the height, this was the height of lockdown, we'd all been locked down for weeks at that point. If a member of the public had asked you in that press conference whether they could go and meet their colleagues outside in the office where they were working and have a drink, would you have said, yes, that technically is within the guidance?
Well, I set out the position on stage one, and the Prime Minister has accepted this point. If you look at what the Prime Minister said, he said, and I won't repeat his exact words, but he said that he should have just walked straight back in. He should have ended the gathering. Nobody is disputing that point, Sophie. And I also, though, really appreciate the enormous sacrifices, the terrible things people have had to do in this country over the past 2 years to control this virus. I don't for a moment underestimate people's anger about this. I share that anger, but we must, and I hope your viewers would appreciate that the appropriate thing for us to do is to look at the whole array of different allegations, and Chris Mason was talking about some of those just now, establish the full facts of those, and then allow the Prime Minister to come to Parliament and to explain his response to it fully, which I know he will. And I also know that the Prime Minister is committed to addressing the underlying culture there as well.
It's the chasm, it's the disconnect, isn't it, between the email that is inviting people, it's sent out to people in Downing Street, come and enjoy the lovely weather, have some socially distanced drinks in the number 10 garden. It is the disconnect with that email and what you had just been telling people to do. People who at that point in time couldn't see their loved ones, couldn't see their families, couldn't see their parents. There were people in hospital who were dying on their own. It is the disconnect between what is going on inside number 10 and what was happening to the vast majority of the nation.
And I completely agree with you. And it's unacceptable. And the Prime Minister has made that very clear in what he said in Parliament, and I know that the Prime Minister, when he responds in full to the Sue Gray report, and it's right, by the way, he's held accountable to Parliament for that, will be addressing that further. There's no difference in terms of my feeling of anger, your viewers' feeling of anger at this happening.
But how can
we share this, and it needs to be
have
addressed.
Thought that technically fell within the guidelines?
Well, he will go into further detail on that when he responds to the Sue Gray report. The Sue Gray report will set out the facts, and it's worth understanding what the purpose of this report is. It's to have a full explanation of the facts, and then to see how those sit alongside the rules at the time.
We know what the rules were at the time.
Once both those things have happened, the Prime Minister will come to Parliament and be held to account for what happened.
But you had just told us what the rules were. Do you think that technically it could have fallen within the guidelines? Is there for you a grey area there?
Well, and I don't want to sort of be cliched about this, and I do completely accept the underlying point that this thing should never have happened. But we have set up a process for how we determine the exact facts and how those sit alongside the rules, and then the Prime Minister will respond to that properly.
We've seen, and Chris Mason has just made it very clear, the number of parties, the number of events that were going on. You were a cabinet minister, you were there, you presumably were in and out of Downing Street. Did you know that kind of thing was going on?
No, I didn't know that kind of thing was
going on.
You had
no idea about socialising that was going on in Number 10?
No, I didn't have any idea about it. And I think it's important to understand what I and other cabinet ministers and the Prime Minister were doing at the time. We were dealing with this unprecedented global pandemic. We were working on plans for a vaccine rollout. We've had the most rapid vaccine rollout in Europe twice. That's enabled us to have one of the most open economies in Europe. It's enabled us to get the economy back to where it was before the pandemic, unemployment down. That is where our focus was, day in, day out. And I can say to you, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
There was the 2 leaving dues in Downing Street. That is an incredibly stark contrast, isn't it, between what the Queen was doing the day after and the night before. The flags are at half-mast in Downing Street. There are parties, leaving dues going on, drinking, dancing. When did you find out about that?
Well, I found out about it when I read it in the newspapers, and we all saw the dignity and the humility and the sacrifice made by Her Majesty the Queen, as she's shown throughout her entire reign. And I was as disgusted as everyone else that this could have been happening the night before.
What does it say about the culture in Downing Street?
Well, it says to me that the culture in Downing Street does need to be addressed. And I think it's absolutely essential that when the Prime Minister responds to the Sue Gray report, and he's committed to doing that in Parliament, that he addresses that culture. And I know that the Prime Minister is committed to doing exactly this. There were failings. We should have done better, much, much better. We need to up our game, and that needs to be addressed. And I know the Prime Ministers are committed to addressing that.
Who leads the culture in Downing Street? Is the Prime Minister not ultimately responsible for the culture there, for what goes on there?
Yes, the Prime Minister is responsible for it, and I think you saw in his statement to Parliament him taking responsibility for it. And I think you'll see that when he responds to the Sue Gray report, he will again take full responsibility for it. I know from many conversations I've had with the Prime Minister, he's in absolutely no doubt that he should and will take responsibility. And I think you'll see that in the statement that he makes to the House of Commons when this report is produced.
You have come on here to defend the Prime Minister today. Have you spoken to him? Have you asked him for assurances that there will be no more revelations, no more photographs, no more emails?
Well, that's precisely why we have set up this Sue Gray process,
But have you asked him? Did you speak to the Prime Minister before coming on today? Have you got any assurances that that is it?
Well, of course, I speak to the Prime Minister all the time, including before this, and to the best of my and the government's knowledge, that this is the full extent of it. But we can't be.
He has said to you, that is it. There is no more.
This is precisely why we set up this Sue Gray process, because if there are further allegations to come out, all of them have to be brought to the fore. And that's why, if you look at the terms of reference when the PM announced it, and as he said subsequently, he is now allowing everyone to bring forward any further concerns they have. Sue Gray will get to the bottom of all of that so we can see those full facts. And that's why we set it up in that way.
But Sue Gray, I mean, her report, we're expecting to get it next week. But I mean, the Prime Minister is her boss. The Prime Minister has set out the terms of her inquiry, and she cannot be the one to say whether or not he broke the ministerial code. It's just a fact-finding mission, isn't it?
Well, it has two element, in fact 3 elements to the first is to find the full facts, and it really is important that we find the full facts. There's lots of different allegations going around. We have to get to the bottom of it, not just what's happened, but other opportunities for other people to come forward. Secondly, she will set it out alongside the rules at the time. And thirdly, she will advise on disciplinary action. But of course, in terms of the Prime Minister's conduct and the conduct of the government as a whole, he is accountable to Parliament. We as government ministers are accountable to Parliament. So the crucial part of this is that then in response to the Sue Gray report, the Prime Minister will come before Parliament, make a statement. He will be held to account by the Leader of the Opposition, by members of Parliament from all sides. And I am confident that when he does that, he will accept responsibility, and he will also set out steps as to how we improve the culture of what happened in Downing Street.
There is a lot of anger about this, not least in your own party. Tim Lawton is the latest MP to call for the Prime Minister to go. Are you expecting more?
Well, that's up to individual members of Parliament. I don't think the Prime Minister should go, and I'll tell you why I don't think that the Prime Minister should go. I think actually, and I think this was touched on in your paper review at the beginning, I saw a little of it. If you look at where we are, for example, with the Omicron variant, we appear to be coming out of the worst bit. Why? Because we've had this vaccine rollout, this booster. That has been driven by the Prime Minister. We've got the economy in a strong position. Why? Because the Prime Minister took the decision to keep the economy open over the Christmas period in the face of many others calling for something different to be done. In terms of those really big judgment calls, he has got them right. Now, I don't diminish for a second people's anger and frustration and hurt at what has happened, and that has to be addressed. But we also need to look at how, as we come out of Omicron, we move beyond this and deal with the challenge of it, whether that's the NHS backlog or whether that is rebuilding the economy. That's where the focus of the government needs to be.
The Prime Minister stays in position, the Prime Minister fights the next general election. What happens in Scotland when the next general election comes around, where almost every single Conservative member of the Scottish Parliament has called for him to resign?
Well, I have a great deal of respect for Douglas Ross, but I simply disagree with the position that he set out there.
You have a great deal of respect for him, but Jacob Rees-Mogg called him a lightweight politician.
Well, it's up to Jacob Rees-Mogg the words he chooses. I, like Jacob, disagree with what Douglas Ross said, but I wouldn't have chosen those words myself.
What do people say on the doorstep in Scotland then? All those Conservative MSPs calling for the Prime Minister to resign. How do you go into another general election with the Prime Minister at the helm?
Well, I accept people's anger and frustration and hurt at these allegations. I think the way we deal with it is to make sure we establish the full facts and that the Prime Minister responds appropriately, and I know he's committed to doing so, and that we also then make sure that as we come out of this Omicron variant, as we come out, thankfully all the indicators seem to be moving in the right direction on COVID, we deal with the profound consequence of COVID. And I think that people are looking for that kind of leadership. And indeed, I would say the kind of leadership we've seen before in dealing with the crisis in the first place.
Are all restrictions going to be lifted on COVID on the 26th of January in England?
Well, I would very much hope so. It's always been the intention that when we introduce Plan B, we would have it for the minimum period possible. Clearly, we have this review point. The indications are that everything's moving in the right direction, but we'll make that judgment at the point of the final decision, and that will be announced in the proper way.
Oliver Dowden, thank you very much for joining me this morning. Now, some more breaking news. Novak Djokovic has lost his last-ditch court bid to stay in Australia and is set to be deported. I'm joined now for the very latest by Paul Sackle, who has been covering the story nationally for The Age newspaper in Melbourne. Good morning, good afternoon to you there. Just tell us the latest there. What has the reaction been?
The reaction has been very large, as you'd imagine. I think the whole of our country has kind of been waiting on this decision for now 11 days since Djokovic arrived. I've just learned in the last 5 minutes that he's on the way to the airport. He'll be getting on a flight at 10:30 our time, which is about an hour and 45 minutes away, and heading to Dubai. From Dubai, he'll head to Europe. He's not contesting the decision any further. The only option left to him was to take it to the High Court of Australia, which is our highest legal jurisdiction. He would have had to take a number of days to actually seek the approval of the court to have it heard there, which would have been unlikely, and that would have been elongated in terms of the process as well. So this was really the last option he had before his first match on Monday, and he's agreed to get on a plane.
It has been an extraordinary drama. Give us a sense of the mood there in Australia, where COVID cases are very high at the moment, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think that that's partly what led to the visceral reaction to his entry. It's that for the first time, really, since the start of the pandemic, Australia is going through a really large COVID wave of the type that you've experienced in Britain. We have 35,000 cases a day in Victoria, which is the state in which the Australian Open is held. And there was a sense that Djokovic, a wealthy, entitled person with well-known anti-vaccination views, had somehow found a loophole to get into Australia through a back door. I think that fed a lot of the anger, and that anger hasn't really dissipated, even though he had his first legal challenge that was successful. I think the government made the political calculation that they were still on quite popular political grounds in deporting him, and they made that decision on Friday, and the court has upheld it today.
How much has it overshadowed the Australian Open?
I think your international viewers would know better than me how much it's dominated world headlines. So there is an argument that it's given more promotion to the Australian Open than it's ever had, but I don't think it's been positive coverage. I think it's an embarrassment for the organisers. It makes our governments and our federation, where the state and federal governments both have a level of responsibility for public health, look like a bit of a farce. It makes our government look incompetent. And I think it opens Australia up to international criticism. But the tournament starts tomorrow. There's still Rafael Nadal and Daniil Medvedev and lots of other great players. But there's no doubt that this casts a significant shadow over the tournament.
Paul Sackle, thank you very much for bringing us up to date with the latest breaking news there in Melbourne. Now, at Prime Minister's Questions this week, Sir Keir Starmer finally did something his party has wanted to for a long time. He called for the Prime Minister to resign. But will it make any difference at all? Well, Sir Keir Starmer joins me now for his New Year Leader interview.
Good morning.
Good morning. Did the Prime Minister break the law?
I think he broke the law. I think he's as good as admitted that he broke the law. And after all, Downing Street has now apologised to the Queen for some of the parties that have gone on. And I know that the government's holding position is let's all wait for the Sue Gray report. But I think it's pretty obvious what's happened. There's industrial-scale partying that's been going on at Downing Street. Not much of it is really denied. And I think that the public have made up their mind. I think the facts speak for themselves. I think the Prime Minister broke the law. I think he then lied about what had happened because, and this compounds the situation. When I first challenged the Prime Minister just about 6 or 7 weeks ago in Parliament about when the first allegations were coming out, he stood at the dispatch box and said, I've been assured there were no parties. So that was his position. Then what happened was there was the Allegra video came out back at the dispatch box, so I challenged him again, at which point the Prime Minister said, I'm furious. I've just found out about these parties. I'm furious. And then, of course, last week, it emerged that he himself was at the party, or one of the parties, in May 2020. And his third defence is, I was there, but I didn't realise it was a party. And there was a little bit of detail he gave in that answer, which is crucially important. He said at the dispatch box, had I appreciated, I would have got everybody back in. So after half an hour, he realised, as he was sort of kicking around the bottles in the Downing Street garden, that there was a party. So, and he says he should have got people in. How does that fit with his first defence, there were no parties?
Well, you're talking about it as a lawyer.
Defence that he was furious. No, but
I know you are talking about it as a lawyer with your lawyer's hat on as well. And are the police right to wait then for Sue Gray's report?
But just
if you say he's broken the law, are the police right to wait? Are the police right to wait?
Just let me finish this point and I'll come straight to that. The public are angry that there were parties, but they're also angry that he's lied about them. So the two go together.
Right to wait?
Well, I think that once Sue Gray has come to her findings, so she will set out all the facts. She's very well respected. I think that all of those should be passed to the police to look at. But I don't go along with this idea that we've all got to wait somehow. I think it's blindingly obvious what has happened. I think that the public have made a mind.
Why do we have to wait? Well, you're prejudging the report, though, aren't they? Why did they have to wait? The police have to wait for Sue Gray's report, but you're prejudging it.
Well, they've already apologised to the Queen. If they didn't do anything wrong, what have they apologised for?
So I go back to my original point. Why are the police not investigating it already?
Well, I just think the sensible thing now, if Sue Gray's report is next week, as you say, and I don't know whether it will be, I mean, the problem is every time she gets the final chapter, there's more allegations and she has to do more work. But those findings should be handed to the police. But, we don't. The facts speak for themselves, and the country has made up its mind. And
if
we've got
if Sue Gray next week, whenever she comes back with her report, if she comes back and says that the Prime Minister has not done anything, the Prime Minister has not done anything knowingly wrong, will you retract your call for him to resign? Will you accept that?
I don't think she will.
But that's what you think. But
just hear me out, because I think what she will do is to establish the facts. So she will say, having interviewed whoever she's interviewed, etc., this is what happened on this day, this is what happened on the next day, this is who was there as far as I could work it out. So she will set out the facts and
if the facts say that he has not done anything knowingly wrong, will you withdraw your call for him to resign?
I don't think that she has the remit to come to a finding on whether the rules were breached or whether anyone's committed a criminal offence.
But if she does, we don't know what her report is going to say, but if she were to find that the Prime Minister had not done anything knowingly wrong, would you withdraw your call for him to resign?
Sophie, I'm not just playing the lawyer here, it's very important. Her remit is to find the facts. Whether they breach the rule is for somebody else to. She is not going to decide whether it was a criminal offence. I'm as certain as I can be about that. And therefore, anybody who's waiting for that report to find out whether the government or the Prime Minister broke the rules is not going to find it in that report, because it will set out the facts. But we don't need that report.
But you have prejudged that in a sense, haven't you? Because you're waiting for her, yet you've called for him to resign. You're waiting for her report. This is what all I'm asking is, if she says he hasn't done anything wrong, the Prime Minister personally he didn't realise, or whatever she says, would you then withdraw your call for him to resign?
No, I don't. I'm clear in my own mind that he's broken the rules, broken the law. He's apologised. They've apologised to the Queen, and I don't need the Sue Gray report. But I'm not doing Sue Gray down. I know Sue Gray. She's a woman of great integrity and great respect, and everybody who knows her says the same thing about her. But if you look at her remit, it is to establish the facts. And so she will say, this is what happened, this is when it happened, this is who was there. But I think it's extremely unlikely that she is going to start saying, the Prime Minister or anybody else committed a criminal offence. She's not going to do that.
It's a big call for you to stand there and say he must resign. If he doesn't, what are you going to do? Are you going to keep asking for him to resign until there's a next general election?
Well, I've been prompted many times to call for the Prime Minister to resign.
I know, and you haven't done it.
I've always resisted, but we've reached a point, and this is the important thing. The Prime Minister has degraded the office of Prime Minister, and he has lost all authority, not only in his own party, but in the country. And therefore, when he tries to persuade the public about how they should behave during the rest of the pandemic, he won't be taken seriously. And it's not just the pandemic. There's at the moment, there are Russian troops in Ukraine. We've got energy bills and we've got the NHS. So he's lost authority. We are a country...
You know what I'm going to ask.
Just let me finish. Because I have decided to make this call. It's a very important call. I waited, but we're now a country paralysed by the weakness of the Prime Minister. And that's why, in the national interest, he has to go.
Have you broken COVID rules?
No, I haven't.
So what is that photograph that a lot of people will have seen? It's been on the front pages. It's taken last year, end of April, beginning of May. Just explain what that was.
Happily. I was in a constituency office just days before the election. We were very busy. We were working in the office. And we stopped for something to eat. And then we carried on working. That is the long, the short of it. No party, no breach of the rules, and absolutely no comparison with the Prime Minister.
But there were rules in place. This was Step 2 guidelines at the time. No person may participate in a gathering in the Step 2 area which consists of 2 or more people and takes place indoors unless it's reasonably necessary for work purposes.
We were in the office, the constituency office. It was days before the election. We were very busy. We were working. At some point, some food turned up. We stopped, we had our food, and then we carried on working. That is not a breach of the rules. It's not a party, and it is no comparison to the Prime Minister.
But drinking a beer, is that reasonably necessary for work purposes?
We'd stopped to eat a takeaway whilst we were working in the office, and then we carried on. This was, just to put it in context, this was about a few days before the May elections. We were really busy. We'd been at it all day on Zoom calls. We were doing members' calls from that very office. We stopped because food arrived, and then we carried on.
There were rules in place, and the guidance, the workplace guidance that was in place at the time. Participants should physically attend meetings only where reasonably necessary. There should not be any sharing of food and drink by staff who do not share a household.
Well, Sophie, trying to persuade anybody that stopping to have some food when you're in the office all day working is a breach of the rules is just not going to wash. And it shows just how far the Conservatives are sinking, that they're trying to pretend there's some sort of comparison between this and the industrial scale partying that the Prime Minister's been up to.
But that photograph of the Prime Minister on the terrace at Downing Street, Dominic Cummings is there, the cheese and wine photograph. Why is that any different? That is an office. We can't hear what they were saying. They say it was a meeting. You say that was a meeting. Why is that any different?
Well, people will look at the photos and make their own minds up. But I think that there is simply no comparison.
That is my point. People are making their own minds up on photographs, aren't they? And they were having cheese and wine, they say. They were having a work meeting like you were. They were outside, which actually is safer in terms of the virus than being inside drinking beer with colleagues.
But Sophie, I've explained we were in the office. It was days before the election. We were working really hard. At some point in the evening, a takeaway arrived and we stopped and we ate it. That is the long and the short of it. Not a party, not a breach of the rules, and no comparison with the Prime Minister.
So you have accepted that drinking was OK within the guidelines at the time. Where do you draw the line?
Well, the line is drawn in the rules. And the Prime Minister broke the rules.
I've just shown you. I've just told you what the rules. I mean, that is the point, isn't it? The rules were great. It's difficult. The rules weren't great, but I mean, how they've been interpreted.
It's not a question of how they've been interpreted. It was perfectly lawful to meet for work, which is what we were doing. The party that was put to the Prime Minister on Wednesday happened because an invitation was sent to 100 people saying, let's have some socially distant drinks in the garden and bring your own booze. There is simply no comparison, and anybody who's trying to make the comparison is really just sinking in this mire. We've had industrial scale parting from the Prime Minister, and then we've had his 3 defences and the lies that have gone behind those defences. It simply can't be right for the Prime Minister to say he was assured there were no parties. By the way, who assured him? His principal private secretary sent out the invites, or somebody else? So then he says he's furious about the parties. Now he says he was at the party, but he didn't realise.
So all that happening whilst we've been living under strict rules, strict restrictions. Is it right now that all restrictions should be dropped in the next 10 days?
Look, I think the sooner we can lift the final restrictions, the better. I think that's what the whole country wants. I think it's important that we're led by the science on this. We've had access to the government scientific and medical advisors, and that's helped us form our views. I hope those restrictions can be lifted
in 10 days' time?
As soon as possible, but I want them to be lifted because the medical science says they should be lifted, not simply because the Prime Minister is in a real mess and he's desperately trying to get out of it. So if it's the right thing to lift those restrictions, we will vote to lift those restrictions, but we'll be led by the science, as we always have been, not by the politics of propping up a broken Prime Minister.
Do you accept that the Prime Minister was right not to bring in restrictions in England before Christmas?
Well, he did bring in restrictions. He brought in Plan B. He brought in Plan B. The only reason...
Those were measures, they weren't restrictions, but yes.
Well... Let's not argue about that.
Was he right or not?
He was right to bring in those measures, but the truth is they wouldn't be in place now if the Labour Party hadn't voted for them because he'd lost control of his own party. So the Prime Minister stands in Parliament, says these measures are necessary to protect public health, but he can't get them through in his own vote. So we stepped up in the public interest, showed the leadership that he lacks, voted for those measures, and that is why we have Plan B measures in place at the moment,
you were pushing for more restrictions at the time before Christmas.
No, we weren't.
Wes Streeting went on. He went on television. He said the First Minister of Wales had a roadmap for Wales. The First Minister of Scotland had set out measures in Scotland. Why is the Prime Minister unable to show the same leadership for England? He said that just 5 days before Christmas.
He wasn't calling for more restrictions, and the fact that the Prime Prime Minister lies and says Wes Streeting was calling for restrictions doesn't mean that we were calling for restrictions. We had access to the government experts, we discussed the evidence, and we voted for the Plan B measures because it was in the national interest to do so. And that's the only reason we've got those measures in place. So this fabrication that we were asking for a lockdown, calling for a lockdown, is a fabrication. It's a bit of a compliment, frankly, to the Labour Party that the Prime Minister and his ministers feel that they've got to fabricate an account of events before Christmas to defend their own position.
It is about the big calls, isn't it? And I mean, also in July, you called for, when the Prime Minister said he was going to lift all the restrictions, you said that was reckless.
I said they shouldn't all be done in one go, and I thought we should have kept, for example, masks for longer, and I think we should have done. But look, those measures, those Plan B measures, are only in place because the Labour Party stepped up and acted in the national interest, the right thing to do according to the evidence.
You're flying high in the polls at the moment. Do you accept what some say, which is that the reason you're doing so well is actually because of the mistakes the Prime Minister is making, not what you are actually doing?
Well, look, I think it's a combination, as it always is. Every time we're behind in the polls, everybody says that's the fault of the Labour Party. Now we're ahead in the polls. Obviously, I'm not going to deny the Prime Minister's in a mess of his own making, but we have now got a new team in place. I had a reshuffle in the autumn. We're out there with strong policies. Yesterday, I was announcing our plan for the NHS on mental health, etc. So whilst the Prime Minister is dithering about rule breaking, we're out there with strong proposals for the country. So it's a mixture of both. I hope now we've got the chance to be heard and we're going to take it.
Sir Keir Starmer, thank you very much for joining us this morning. And that is it from us. See you next week. Goodbye.